Welcome to Season 3 of Maintaining Mental Fitness, a free webinar series to support mental fitness for organizations and individuals in an endemic world. A big thank you to our sponsors, the Continuing Care Safety Association and Biz Safety Software.
Thanks, Sydney. I hope it's an amazing conversation. Control can be a crunchy one, and I think what's also interesting is, Jesse, you and I banter about this kind of stuff all the time, but to do it on a live session format, it'll be fun to provide some structure, but also see where this goes.
Yeah, I agree.
So right now, in this very moment, how would you rate your perception of the level of control you are experiencing?
Why I'm laughing at that question is because when we were talking prior about, how do we bridge from Sydney's intro to getting into our topic, and we had a few ideas, and you're like, well, I'm just gonna hit you with it on the fly, which in many sense feels like not very much. And when I think about my experience, both just as a person, as a leader, we're right now on site doing some client work where there's a bunch of stuff that have no control over, that's impacting timelines and how we're delivering, and my current moment with what question was coming and all that kind of stuff. And it's funny for me when reflecting on the idea of control is how little of it we literally have, but then how much the possible need for control influences the behaviors we might do, and how we show up, and how we behave, how we think, how we feel even. And for me, it's a pretty vulnerable conversation of being a person who, if I'm being honest, like thrives with feeling at least the false sense of having control over things. So it's really, I think, a fascinating time given all of the stuff that's happening around us.
So tell me then what that feels like. What does control feel like?
It's a really good question. And I do think there's some nuance, like with the focus of our conversation today is a lot about leadership. And I do think there's a little bit of a nuance that can exist between leadership and personal, but it often can show up in similar ways. So when I think about control, some of the keywords that come into my mind are things like power over, or your agenda, or you might be seeking, particularly from a leadership perspective, not allowing a lot of room for feedback or flexibility in that it needs to happen this exact way and the outcome needs to be that. And so when I think about control, those are the types of things that I feel are ideas that we might have about it, or feelings we might have about control. And whereas if I look at the opposite side around like influence, it feels a little bit more of like a with, or empower, or buy-in, or we need to be very flexible and adaptable, because it's likely, say, for example, we want to do a report like in our work, how we get to that report being done might look different for you than it might for me, than it might for another staff member. And allowing space for that, to me, breeds more on the influence side of things.
Okay, so which feels more comfortable, control or influence?
I don't know, because that's an awesome question, because I think in some ways control can feel more comfortable, but I almost feel like it's a false sense of comfortable, in that it might be something that we're used to. It might be like even the idea of feel safe, where maybe you're not challenging and exploring yourself, but you are in perceived control of what's happening around you. On the other side of it, when I think about trying to foster more influence or maybe less control, that can feel really scary. It can feel like you need to be wrestling with a lot of internal script and thought. You might need to consider more what others think. And then I think in addition to that, on the other side of it, it can be really empowering for the person who's relinquishing that sense of control. Like I think about in leadership practices that I try to do, and not that it's perfect in any way, but if I'm regularly trying to challenge, is this a control thing? Where's this coming from? And ultimately, my actions can often end up moving closer towards who I might want to be. In that sense, it can feel more fulfilling and more purposeful, and all of those like positive, comfortable, or exciting and emotions that we seek. So I guess all in said, like there's discomfort that can exist in both. And in control type of behaviors, I feel it can be a false sense of comfort and safety. That essentially means there might be things bubbling under the surface. I think about the work that we do with a number of organizations where we'll come in and have conversations with employees and staff and leaders at all levels. And a thing that becomes evident is that where high control or high power is present, there becomes a real solid culture of silence where people are trying not to rock the boat. They're trying to keep things safe so that we can all keep surviving, which again, I think fosters that false sense of control.
Yeah, because it's interesting, even within ourselves, there's some things we can control and there's things we can't control. And so when we're talking about control at a leadership level, what I heard you say is that we'll use control maybe to make ourselves feel safe, like we're in control, but that can have a very different impact on the people that we're leading. They might not feel safe in that.
100%. Yeah, go ahead.
So when you are, because I think too, is you like control is a bit of an illusion, because how much control do you have over your employees?
Again, I think it's none, but in actuality, because there's constantly lessons to be learned in how little you may have thought you've had based on behaviors, which is again for me where influence becomes such an important element. And when I think about influence, I think about things like trust or honesty or clarity, alignment. Like these types of things are very hard and can be very sticky. And I think that can then foster maybe a sense of security and stability that I think is very different than control, where we have a more common understanding of what we need to do and perhaps how we need to do it and what outcomes we want to accomplish, versus again that power over stance where it almost in many ways I find fosters less of the outcomes that you're trying to get as a leader. So if I think about what is the leader trying to accomplish, often when there's behaviors that are more control based, like being very directive, maybe even taking the work from staff members, it's often because, at least in my experience and even in coaching leaders, it's often trying to be helpful or wanting to strive towards a common business objective or what have you. And what's interesting is the behaviors that are often accompanying these feelings of control and fears that may come with it end up creating actions within yourself and the staff that move you further away from successfully and effectively accomplishing those business objectives. So I guess coming back to the initial question is, for me, some of this is actually acknowledging the fact that you don't really have control and then walking into that with your staff, as opposed to trying to drag them or have that power over them in trying to accomplish whatever it is you're trying to accomplish.
Right. And I think that's a bit of the nuance, right? Is whether it's your spouse or anyone else, we know you cannot control another person, but then we introduce a salary or an exchange that gives us a certain amount of authority. But authority isn't necessarily then earned, or you can't necessarily get to the outcome you want by necessarily trying to control the person. And so as you move into influence, what are some of the behaviors that you would recommend when you're moving away from control tactics and into more influencing?
Yeah, and if I could just initially touch on some of the pre-frame you were providing there, it fostered a thought in my mind as we were talking about this, and what I noticed that leaders are struggling with is we're kind of uncoupling ourselves from a work style where there was very much like, I told you to do this, so go do it because I'm the leader. And if I think about the individual that leader might be telling that thing to, they're often in a much more vulnerable position. Like, generally speaking, if I think about how we've progressed as a culture over the last number of years, much higher proportions of our working force might have been in the lower levels of something like Maslow's hierarchy, where base needs were a real thing. And not that they're not for many people today, but I find that they're less. And so with that idea, you were able to hold over salary or job or these elements as big levers to pull to create behaviors that you wanted to create. And that was really just tapping into fear within our people, I think, in many ways. Where now what we're noticing with the shift, and when you look at things like, the Great Resignation, and we speak about it as like, it's really a great reevaluation of what's important for ourselves. I'll speak for myself particularly. Like, I have the privilege of growing up in a way that food on the table, clothing on my back, a house to sleep in was not something that was needing to be on my mind, and that I was like constantly worrying about those elements. So that gives me a lot of freedom to then look at the next levels of Maslow's hierarchy and seek more and seek better. So I think it's just an important piece to like anchor, in that when we're having the conversation and we're going to be talking about what types of things could leaders be doing to foster influence, I do think it's important to recognize that we don't want to create a culture of, hey, if you were someone who did power over, or you were someone who was living in that relationship, you're a horrible person, or it's your fault, you're wrong. And that in itself can foster real challenges for those people. And so for me, it's always important to look at a situation of understanding of why might that have existed at those times. Does that make sense, like, to you, Daena, as we're like chatting as to why that was such a commonly used tactic, even given the cultural and social dynamics that might have been existing versus maybe where we're heading now? And so we require a different skill to get the outcomes we need to get as leaders.
Right. So a little bit before we move from control to influence is a little bit of analysis about our current behaviors. Are they moving us to the direction that we want them to be? How did we learn these behaviors? Because often from a control tactic, that's the way it was done. That's how we were taught. And so that's how we know how to get some kind of response or get something done.
Get an outcome. Yeah, because I think it'd be naive for us to think that it wasn't working at some point, because at some point it was working and working very well. And that's how so many things have grown and established and built such successful businesses and such. The piece that I'm really curious about, yeah, it's worked at some point and it might even still work going forward, but is it the best way that we can do things for, most importantly, ourselves and who we want to be, but also thinking about supporting human beings and hopefully creating spaces, which I feel is why people are on this call, that people aren't showing up to work feeling like they're breaking themselves down physically, emotionally, psychologically at work, and then leaving to go home broken. I think we are asking ourselves, are there different ways in which we can accomplish similar outcomes, if not better outcomes, that actually supports the human being? And that to me is where a lot of interest sits with, around ideas around what types of behaviors could happen with influence and as a leader.
Which are?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And I think for me, the biggest one that I've recognized is transitioning our thoughts from being in a place of, I need to solve all the problems, to how can I help solve the problems with you? And to me, the behavior that is almost continually observed within that is really asking more questions. And what that I find does is that, one, it creates a better understanding and creates space for the person you're leading to build the solutions themselves, then own those solutions, feel empowered about it, as well as it also releases the burden on you as the leader to feel like you need to hold it all and carry it all forward, and you're the only one that can get it done. And then I think it also hones in your understanding of the question and what the real problem is. So if I was to say, is the one overarching thing. I think there could be many, but asking questions is probably a good way to start. Now, what asking questions look like is something that I'm continually learning, might be different depending on the person. I think about like our dynamic, Daena, and I know sometimes you kind of give me grief, and I'll say grief, but it's really accountability and setting your own boundaries on. Sometimes the questions can be too much, or they can be too continuous, where it's not creating space for you to reflect and assess your needs and get honest with the communication that you want to purvey. So I think how we ask the questions is really important to learn from the individual, and be willing to sit in the fact that you're probably going to get it wrong sometimes when going back and forth, but we need to sit in that discomfort as we spoke about last time.
So the process that you're speaking of sounds like it takes a little bit more time. It takes some pause, and it takes a lot of self-awareness and added effort to try a new approach. And so what would you say to someone who is curious about relinquishing some control, but not sure how to go about it?
It's a great question. So I think one that shows up just on the time one first, because I find that's one all the time, like where, you know, when you talk about asking questions, it's really about getting into coaching conversations and supporting people. And so often I hear like, I get it, I see it's important, but how am I going to do that? Like, I don't have time. I'm on a treadmill constantly. I don't have time to sit and ask questions. And what I find is actually can occur is by first starting with like almost a mini cost benefit analysis of the behavior itself. So more broadly, like what does doing control type behaviors offer me that are benefiting me? I think is important. Acknowledge, because we're getting some benefit in acting the way that we've been acting. What are the things that are the consequences? Kind of sitting in that. How do you feel about that? Then looking on the other side, well, what if I was to transition to behaviors that felt more positioned to foster influence and walk with our staff? What would the benefits of those type of behaviors be? What are the consequences? And then it can honestly be a bit of an intellectual decision as to which ones provide me the best or the most benefits and most consequences. And when doing that, I find often the answer becomes relatively in front of you, or I don't want to say easy, but it gets put in front of you. And I think about specifically around asking questions when doing this type of cost benefit relationship, with asking questions with your employees first before giving answers. What inevitably happens is, particularly around time, the leaders self-diagnose that they spend or will spend far less time if they take the 10, 20, 30, even 60 minutes up front, creating understanding and alignment, as opposed to giving a directive that then often comes back around 4 or 5 days or a week later, that then they spend a whole bunch more time, because it's not only trying to fix the task that's being done, but also fix some of the emotion or frustration around that on both sides. And that in itself ends up creating like a constant fire drill. Yep. Is what I regularly see when working with leaders. So even though space feels impossible and feels like it's now adding more to my calendar, in many ways it can help create less or more, and actually focus intention and amplify impact for yourself and those around you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the process can sometimes create more frustration in ourselves as we try and learn about ourselves in the dynamic. But I know we talk so much about within leadership, there's every interaction you have with your employees is an opportunity to charge or to drain. And that's a big responsibility. And so in order to, move from this, constant frustration also with bumping heads is also not helpful. So in order to move into that place of influence, you need to have a lot of trust. And so what is your relationship status with your employees? In building influence almost sounds like you're building better relationships. with your employees.
Yeah, 100%. It's really taking time to build those authentic, connected relationships. Because what I find within that is that when mistakes happen, because they're going to happen, or you're going to do actions, to your point earlier, that might drain an employee's bank account. In those actions, what occurs is, if we have alignment, you might know who I want to be. And so you actually might take the time to give feedback on, hey, when I experienced this, this is what happened. Or there might be a compassionate statement of, oh, wow, there must be something else going on. Like, the behavior that I'm seeing is probably not about me. It's about whatever's here. And that doesn't give forgiveness to the behavior, but what it does is anchor the ability to try again and improve next time. Or I love one of the more recent podcasts that Simon Sinek and Adam Grant and Brene Brown did, where Adam Grant threw into space, like, I'd love if we could more regularly talk about when you receive something that you didn't feel quite communicated the intention, or was layered with some additional elements or emotions that maybe distracted from the initial intent, to say something back like, should have said, like, how did you, what was it you're actually trying to say within that interaction? And I think, again, allowing that space for humans to have that relationship is so critical. And when you have that trust, it gives that forgiveness, compassion, as well as accountability, to say, I'm here for you to help you move along. And to me, that's a two-way relationship, whether that's leader to employee or even employee to leader. It becomes a two-way relationship that's built together.
Absolutely. Too much rigid control can almost break down the relationship, whereas influence is a step towards building it.
Yeah, I really believe that.
You get better outcomes when you have better relationships.
Sure. I mean, and what's fascinating, and again, it actually came from the same podcast that we were listening to. There's so much conversation about, like, what do SEAL teams bring to the table, as what could arguably be the most high performing teams in the world or organization. And what often gets distorted is the attributes get attached to an individual. And when you think about that, there is no perfect human individual. And so we're trying to take the concepts and things that occur in high performing teams and find them in single people. And that's not possible. It's a high performing team for a reason. And I think about our team, where we have a lot of overlap, but we also each have our own different distinct gaps that others overlap to, again, create a high performing team. And so the idea of influence in a leadership world is recognizing there is going to be no perfect human being. What we're trying to create is a team that's cohesive, connected, and ultimately trying to achieve performance. And starting with that occurs together as opposed to one, I think is really critical as we continue to move forward, particularly given all the cultural factors around isolation and transactional interactions that occur. Finding that space to create that connection is so critical.
Is that the main primary takeaway you think could be taken from today, or is there something else that you would like people to take away when moving from control to influence?
So when you say the main primary takeaway, are you saying, like, at the central of influence is fostering connection is like your primary thing to remember?
Is that
so you're
with today?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is that. And I think for me, at the center of leadership is, how do we create connection and belonging? It's, yes, we want people to do assigned functions, but those assigned functions and the ability for the people to do them in an effective way, I think, are more of an outcome of feeling belonging within a space and feeling, again, connected, seen, heard, valued. All of that stuff is where I feel that high performing teams can occur. So I think it would be that, as a leader, if you try to take more or try to focus on more behaviors that are from an influential perspective, where you're walking with your staff, that's going to drive more connection and belonging. That's going to drive better outcomes for whatever business that you're trying to focus on. Getting to there is a different story. So if you were to say again, well, what would you want to remember? For me, the remembering is not so much, hey, I think we all could agree we want to create connection and belonging, but as the individual leader, how can you get there? It's going to be really challenging. And there's going to be a lot of learning and unlearning. And what I can share for me personally is the learning and unlearning is the role that my ego might play in relation to interacting with staff members, where, you know, I think we've even had conversations where I've acknowledged a few times where it's like, I just want to say, like, suck it up and get it done and like just do this thing. But that might not be best in the situation to, again, foster that influence with the staff member, because that one thing is important, but we're trying to build something more long lasting. And recognizing when I've had behaviors or things where it's often coming from an ego stance of feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm losing control, I'm feeling scary about that, I'm whatever. For me, it's important to be aware of how might your own ego show up to protect you, and what might be the behaviors that accompany that, and then owning those behaviors. And that's not only owning them with yourself, but also owning them with the people that might have been impacted by it. So to me, the thing to take away is more about, it's going to be a bumpy road. We're going to make mistakes, and figuring out what are the emotions that might start to foster the mistakes of going back to control behaviors, and then taking steps to talk to your people about, this is what I want to move towards. I want to move towards more of influence-based leadership, and I'm looking for the understanding and accountability to help me get there. And so recognizing that it is, again, going to be bumpy, it's going to be hard, and you're not going to be perfect in doing it all the time.
But you feel it's worth it.
It's most definitely, I mean, at least right now, I mean, check in with me maybe next year. I know I'm joking on that, but no, I think it is most definitely worth it, because I think we all want to, at least in my belief system, is that most people, and in particular leaders, care a lot about their people and their organization. And sometimes the behaviors that we demonstrate care with might be opposite experiences being created for the people receiving those behaviors. And so for me, where it becomes worth it is that it allows you to find behaviors that are more consistent with who you want to be and what feels you're striving to create with those around you. Again, it just requires that time to look at it.
So I'm being mindful of time. Do we want to open it up to any questions?
Sure, if there's any in the chat or Q&A.
I heard something. It doesn't look like there's any in the chat. Any final thoughts then to wrap up?
No, just thanks for the space. I know we had to adjust our timing and everything from last week to this week, as you know, talking about control. Last week, a flight kept getting delayed that then changed all the planning. So I appreciate those that did join the call and their flexibility in making it work, and look forward to seeing those next week in our next conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.